6. And thank you all for joining us. And this will be going out to YouTube for the Michigan group. It will be on their website attached shortly in just a day or two. It will come to my YouTube channel, Ida Norris Dressage YouTube, and it will come out in podcast. So keep looking. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll get started tonight. Thanks for joining us. To begin with, it's all about actually talking about the biomechanics. And originally in 1996, I wrote a paper that was an original paper published in Dressage and CT magazine called The Theory of Bend. Oops, and a good deal of this information tonight is from that paper. There are 5 parts or areas of the horse where judges and trainers think that they can see bend, and we're going to talk about whether it really is bend or what your mind says to you about it. But the pull works in 2 ways: direct flexion, which is the horse becoming more directly perpendicular to the ground, and lateral pull rotation, also known as lateral pull flexion. The neck actually can bend, it can bend, and you just have to keep in mind that the column of the neck, the actual vertebra, of course, we know the nuchal ligament is right under the mane, and it's like a huge rubber band which pulls the neck up and down, but in the horse's neck is the vertebra, and when a horse actually bends its neck sideways, it also twists those vertebrae, which is something that we all sort of know intellectually, but we don't think about a lot. And as we progress today, we'll talk about how that twisting of the vertebra while the horse bends can affect things. The shoulders themselves, or as we refer to the withers, which are the scapulas of the horse, they kind of stand up and they kind of flex around. They go up and down. They're not attached with anything that's solid like a joint, but it's all muscle, ligament, tendons supporting all that area, which flexes around, and the shoulders have some small amount of flexing possible. Not a lot, very little. The rib cage itself, which is where you're actually thinking the girth is, where your girth is, and under your legs, that area of the horse only flexes 3 degrees is the maximum amount of flexing. And then the hips and the hindquarter area, if the horse is capable of tracking behind the hind legs, which is how we perceive that a horse bent around a circle or a curve, if the hind legs track behind the front legs, if that actually happens, the hips, the SI, and all of the hind leg joints work in connection with each other, and they have to work in conjunction with each other in order for the hips and the SI and hind leg joints to slip around lower and transfer weight from one side to the other in order for this all to happen. And the SI joint, in coordination with all of the other joints, the stifle, and the hips lower, one side of the hip or the other will lower and swivel around slightly. The leg joints take weight and push weight back and forth from one side to the other. And this works like the differential joint in your truck. And it's an amazing combination of joints which work all together, but it doesn't actually bend like you think of bending. It's a transfer and a slipping around the hips lower, the inside leg when engagement occurs, and when bending occurs, adducting of the inside hind occurs, which means that that leg steps more under the body of the horse towards its midline. So just to go through the 5 places that your brain or a judge thinks or a trainer thinks that they see when they say to you a horse doesn't have bend, these are the 5 areas that could possibly be in their mind that didn't somehow, quote, bend per se. And here's a drawing which helps us get an idea about this from the side, that the pole is right here because this is the back of the skull. And the skull, and this is what would be your occiput, the back part of the skull. A horse's skull backs up to and is parallel to, whoops, sorry, to C1 and C2. Now, a human skull, the back of it falls down over and covers C1 and C2, and ours works a little bit differently. A horse's works that the back of his skull backs right up to C1, and so he can flex down this way or tip his nose up. And so when a horse flexes at the pole down directly, this is called direct flexion. And lateral pole flexion is when he turns his head like we do, like Rosemary's Baby or E.T., that he pivots his head rather than bending his neck to look to the right or to the left. We were just talking about the spinal column within the neck, the cervical vertebrae, and they are here. And, we kind of intellectually know that they go up and down like a column, but because we're so focused on looking down at the horse from sitting on it, that we we know that it's not here where the nuchal ligament is, but you just kind of lose that concept sometimes. And so when a horse actually bends its neck, it does flex left and right, but these also rotate in order for this horse to bend all around. When he decides that his nose is going to come down here and scratch this, he's going to pick this up and he's going to chew on his ankle. There's a lot of rotation in here. One of the reasons riding instructors talk to us about not crossing the rein across is that enough twisting of the head around and up and over and across can damage this area. Here's the scapulas, the withers, and these are, as we were just talking about, attached with ligaments, muscles, tendons all around this area and to the rib cage and to the spine itself. And these float up and down, they pop around, they rotate like front wheel drive cars a little bit. So they have some flexion. One of the things we're looking for is when the thoracic sling works, this whole area lifts up, which is pretty amazing. And that's when we talk about the thoracic, and we're coming to that. The rib cage area is right here. You're sitting over these areas, and this only flexes 3 degrees. And here's the edges of the hip is here, and the SI as we know it, stifles, hocks, fetlocks, and pastern area. This whole area works all together to move and transfer weight back and forth and propulse the horse forward. And in reality, does it bend? Only by virtue of all of these joints working together and moving weight around and flexing. The lumbar vertebra, which are right here, which is just behind your saddle, because this is, the saddle, the end of the saddle's right here. These don't bend sideways at all. They're not even physically possible to go, make a curve. They don't curve. They undulate up and down, and the horse's body rolls around, and this part rolls around. So you have the feeling that the barrel is undulating sideways. And when you look down on a horse, like you take a videotape of a horse walking and you see its back kind of going like this, but it doesn't actually bend sideways. It undulates around, which is fascinating. So quick review. This is how our brain makes us think. Like, let's say you're lunging the horse, and when you perceive that you think the horse is bending on a 20-meter circle or a 10-meter circle, Your mind tells you that it's bending around like a Chiquita banana, sort of in this incredible bend. But here is what actually happens. And this is when you get a 10 on a circle, the horse actually is bending. And this is what we want it to do. This is what you think it did. Look at that. The lumbar seems to be bending, which we know isn't possible. This is actually how it looks. And if the rider is properly placed and the horse is actually bending in all the areas that it's capable of appearing to be flexing, I'm going to put appearing to bend, then this is what it looks like. The pole rotated a little bit, and as the rider, you're sitting here, you can just barely see the inside of the eye, and the neck has some flexion. And then the shoulder blades here, they're sort of like front wheel drive car. This one's a little more ahead, this one's a little more further back. There's some flexion. We talk about the rider's seat and shoulders follow the shoulders of the horse. So the scapulas have very slight flexion. The rider the same, the outside shoulder just a little tiny bit ahead, the inside one maybe a little back. The rib cage has only 3 degrees of flexion, and you can see as you progress through the back of this horse that obviously through this rib cage area there is less and less flexion going on here, because you're like, I think it's flexing up here. The further back you look, you're like, this rib cage isn't flexing way back here, because by the time it gets back there, it is floating, but it's near the lumbar. And it's mostly all of the soft tissue, which is below the horse's rib cage, its guts and its soft tissue and all that. Is that all flexing around and moving? And yeah, because that's all soft areas through here. So here's the lumbar. You can see very clearly that we still think the horse is bending. It's correct on the 20-meter circle or the 10-meter circle or whatever, but the lumbar is straight. And then I drew a straight line across here just so that you could see how this hip area is functioning. Usually the inside hip lowers, the outside hip takes weight. Weight is transferred back and forth through here, the SI and all of the hind leg joints. It's kind of amazing when you look at it like this and you go, if you've already thought about it, then I'm preaching to the choir. But if you haven't happened to actually see these diagrams, I got to tell you, the first time I saw these, I kind of flipped out. And I also stopped writing odd things on people's papers, like not enough bend through body. I stopped writing that on tests, because what part of the body did I want it to be in? And if I say that to somebody, how much are they going to crank around on this poor horse when it's capable of a 3-degree bend right here? I became more specific as a judge, saying where I thought there wasn't flexion. And if I referred to bend, I was very specific about where I felt the horse was stiff, rather than saying lacks bend. Not that that isn't an okay, please understand, I'm not criticizing our judges. What I'm saying is that when I learned this, I became just very fussy about my judging. Needs bend is an okay remark for a judge to make, and our judges committee, supports that. But on the other hand, when you're beginning to think about bend, now when you get the paper that says needs bend, you need to go back and look at your own horse and decide about where it was that the horse was stiff. We're looking from the top down about some of this that we were just looking at, and this shows the skull attachment to the cervical, which is really good, and we can see a really good looking down onto the scapulas, and it's just another view of how this looks. And then here we can see where the saddle sits on top of this. So it's just a good review, because a lot of times we just don't look at the skeletons enough of a horse to really think about. This drawing is significant because what's interesting about a horse is that point A, which is right here which is, right at the back of the wither, right at the very edge of the back of the wither, is where the horse's center of gravity is. And I think most of us think about this center of gravity, and we kind of forget that we don't actually sit over the center of gravity. We actually, and this point B, line B, is the center of motion. And that is the position that you need to sit over in order to be stable on the horse. You would think it would be here. And there are a lot of people that get out there and, talk and misspeak by mistake because they talk about this is the center of gravity of a horse, and it is. But that point is not the center of motion. And in order for a rider to be stable, they're going to be over this area. The interesting thing about this is that it's this area right here that is the sweet spot for the horse, which is behind the center of motion and really behind the center of gravity and closer to the center of motion. These are the muscles that we talk about, the sweet spot, that stimulate the horse. That is where your leg needs to be for forward motion and for lateral work. And the closer your leg is to the front, more towards these other lines and closer to the elbow, these tend to tighten some of these areas and restrict forehand reach. So, for example, by mistake, spurs used too far forward restrict forward motion from tightening. We just talked about the pole having direct flexion, which is the horse closing at the pole, and this is referred to or known as closed at the pole or closing at the pole. And that's when the horse gives in the jaw or TMJ, and his face tends to come more vertical. The horse is willing and it's soft in the connection, and it's capable of bringing its nose in slightly at request, and the positioning of the horse closer or nearer towards a vertical. This is always referred to as closed at the pole. And in our test, it says giving that the horse will give in the jaw, will soften in the hand. And this is what we're talking about, that the horse gives in the pole and the TMJ. This is necessary for top line throughness and back suppleness. If a horse is unwilling to exhibit a willingness to give in the jaw and begin to come slightly more towards a vertical, we see horses sometimes that, their noses just go straight out. They don't give in the pull or the jaw at all. You will not have throughness. You will not be able to develop back suppleness or engagement. So part of a horse coming round to a bridle, being round to connection, being soft to a rider, is that it's willing to close the pole. And these are the words that we use anatomically for this. Closing the pole is direct flexion. Pole rotation or lateral pole flexion, as we know, is the horse willing to turn at the pole. And keeping the ears level, the horse swivels the head laterally, and it's swiveling its skull in relation to the first cervical vertebra. When a horse appears from the front, when you're looking at a horse in the front to see if it has tilt, what you're looking to see is that the ears appear level. How much is enough lateral pole flexion? In general, the accepted amount is that as the rider sits on the horse, for most normal exercises, like for example, we require lateral pole flexion in side pass, we require it in turn on the forehand, we require it in pivots or turn on the haunches. For these types of exercises, just the smallest amount you can imagine, that you can look down and see past your cheek piece and see the eye slightly. If you can see onto the face of the horse, if you can see more than the eye, it is probably too much. And what will happen probably is you will look down and see that you have neck bend besides lateral pole flexion. Pole rotation has been proven biomechanically to be connected with shoulder flexion and suppleness. Whoops, the old maxim that a horse should follow his head and his nose is correct. And a horse that does not exhibit lateral pole flexion will probably not exhibit lateral flexion through the shoulders or suppleness of the shoulders. Correct pole rotation is required in all exercises and all turns and movements, all corners and lateral movements. The horse has to follow its pole first. Many times when a judge says lax bend, it's the very first thing. The pole didn't go around first, and the pole has to go around first. This biomechanical mention has to do with within the last 15 years or so. A lot of studies have been done that show that the pole and the shoulders are on the same biomechanical system of nerves for the horses. And this is why when you don't have lateral pole flexion, you frequently see horses that are very stiff in the shoulders and vice versa. So new information for us. Again, a drawing, the same drawing again, but just relating again that this near the red, the big red line is the center of gravity as opposed to the center of motion, and that riders have to sit over the center of motion. And if you think about that, here's where the rider's seat is and the leg comes down. If you're not in a chair seat, and this is why alignment is so important, if you're in a chair seat, your leg will be out here in front of line A, which is over by center of gravity. But if you're in correct alignment, your leg will fall onto the sweet spot of the horse. These are the muscles that can stimulate activity behind in the horse for engagement, impulsion, lateral work. The same thing, only now we have rider and tack or saddle and tack, and we're trying to get at that the alignment is through the center of the hip and down through the center of the ankle rather than the heel. And these two pink lines right here on this diagram are just that this horse's black girth blends in, but you're 4 to 6 inches behind the back of the girth on most saddles, and particularly Western saddles. English saddles, you're likely to be 3 to 5, but Western saddles a lot more because sometimes the girthing systems are amazingly close. So here again, without the rider, I've marked it in red. This is actually where the rider sits in this particular saddle, but it also points out that that is the center of motion on this horse, and here the leg would fall down to the sweet spot. So now we're beginning to think about, okay, biomechanically, last month was all about riders and riders' aids, and then we're looking biomechanically at the horse, and now we're really coming together with, now I really understand why equitation, why is equitation important? It works with the biomechanics of the horse. All of this information that I'm going to talk about next is thank you to Dr. Hillary Clayton. She's an amazing woman. We all recognize her as being one of the #1 experts in the United States on biomechanics. And additional recommended reading from this woman, like every judge and every trainer should read The Thoracic Sling by Dr. Hilary Clayton. It was published in January-February issue of 2021 USDF Connection with these illustrations with permission. And she explains and shows very clearly how the thoracic works, the thoracic sling area. The shoulders are supported by the thoracic sling, and thoracic sling muscles are engaged. And when they're engaged or contracted, the scapula, wither, and shoulder area is lifted. When that is lifted, it allows for greater shoulder mobility for bend, flexion through the shoulders, and through the wither area through turns, or shoulder suppleness. The lifting of the chest and the withers, the thoracic sling is contracted, brings the base of the neck up, and it allows greater reach or mobility of the front leg for crossing or ground cover. It allows the neck to be more correctly supported. To be more correctly supported. And the top line is able to reach forward to the bridle, have more uphill balance, and the horse can be more through the back. When the thoracic sling is utilized, the horse is more uphill at the withers, has more freedom of motion, and more ability to balance and bend, keeping in mind that there will be only small amounts of lateral flexion through the shoulders and the rib cage. This is the same horse, and on the left-hand side, the sling muscles, the thoracic sling muscles, are relaxed. I'm going to move you all over here. And on the right, the same horse with the sling muscles contracted, and look at the height difference at the withers. The next thing to notice is that with the sling muscles relaxed, that the sternum is well below the elbow joint. And with the sling muscles contracted, all of a sudden, the sternum is above the elbow joint. This whole area came up, and this is sort of what we were talking about, that these scapula area can really flex around and it can really come up and down. And it's very important that the horses begin to use the thoracic. And thoracic sling use is very specific to how the riders work with the horses and ask the horses to engage the thoracic. It comes down to a great deal of our own riding. And then the riders' biomechanics that we talked about last week and that we're integrating into this biomechanics begins to come into this equation. So here's a wonderful, sorry about that. I'm going to let that run. But this is a really good slide of the same kind of thing from the front. Here's a horse that has its thoracic sling engaged, and it's uphill. It's got its neck up. It has lifted the sternum, and now it's crossing, and it shows tremendous amounts of crossing. Here's the same horse. You see how much narrower the horse is at the chest area with the sling not engaged, not as tall, not as supple. It's amazing how on the left one that the horse's shoulders are looking really robust as it crosses its legs, and here the horse looks like it's chest and narrow even. So how the thoracic sling is worked or engaged or used becomes very important. The next thing to keep thinking about, which is a little bit tough for us because we're Western dressage. We're not Western, and we're not dressage. We're Western dressage. And what that means is that we have to be very careful that we keep reminding people this is not, we have people who come into our division who have strong Western backgrounds, and we're grateful for that, and we're happy they're here, and we're welcoming them. However, some of them have strong pleasure type backgrounds. And we have to keep reminding them, remember, working gaits get you from ranch to ranch. It's not a pleasure ride that we went out and 2 miles should take several hours. Additionally, if they have come from a division that has been encouraging peanut rolling, we have to keep reminding them that the pole is to be the highest point, because this is what causes or is part of the equation of biomechanical balance. This horse here, I'm trying to get y'all out of the way of the horses, of this one horse. Thank you for sending us, Dana, your development picture. She's a very brave young woman. She lets me criticize or say or whatever. She sends me all kinds of pictures. Thank you, Dana. This horse is a beautiful horse in that for Western dressage, this horse is doing the kind of thing that we want to reward. And that is that no matter how green or how more advanced he became, even when he was in his baby balance, and this was his baby balance, just kind of clumping along and a little strung out, but he was cheerful and active. He has his pole above the withers. And we need this because for horses that their poles are below their withers while they're in general travel, that means that the thoracic is not engaged. It means that the horses are not working on their hind end and that they are on the forehand. In those positions, we are not meeting the requirements of the training wheel because we may be compromising their gaits even, which is rhythm, the very first part of the wheel. So it's very important that we keep on this. Now we're going to talk next about the stretch, and that is the stretch that's in the free walk and the stretch in the free jog, because we have a lot of confusion and because we do have horses that are coming in that are balanced downhill from lack of information. So here's a drawing showing a horse possibly starting up here like Dana's Gray was on the last slide. And as it progresses through, the rider's asking it to stretch. It might only get this far in the free walk, or it might get a little further down. We don't know, but she's asking it to move down, and here's how it's going to move down. Now, the only two times in Western dressage when the horse's pole should be below the withers is in the free walk when it is required and asked to stretch, and in the free jog when it is required and asked to stretch. A horse must not come into a test and travel throughout the test all the time, all the way through the test, with the pole lower than the top of the withers. And here's the next part that's a little tricky. And the reason I'm mentioning it is I'm teaching people from all around that don't come in from dressage backgrounds. And they think that that right there, the top of the ears, when you say the pole has to be below the above the withers, they're thinking the ears, the tip of the ears. And we're talking about the crown piece of the pole is right here. So anyway, if you're asking for stretch, I always say to students, well, you need to at least get the tips of the ears below the withers for the judges to consider that you have enough for a reasonably good mark. And it helps them because they have a visual, but you have to be very clear for people that the ears are not what we're talking about. The crown piece of your bridle is the back of the pole, and that has to be above the withers unless you're in the free walk. Now the free walk has two parts to it. When we ask the horse to stretch, it also says stretch and stretch forward. And that's what we were talking about, opening and closing of the pole, which is, from the side, the throat latch area. If you can't remember it, did it stick its nose out? Did it open its throat latch? And so we're looking for this horse to come down and to stretch its nose out. And what does that do? It contracts the nuchal ligament, which acts like an elastic, which pulls the little vertebra up here and separates them and lifts this whole area, which is known as bascule of the back. And it should have helped to lift the thoracic and separate the spine and bascule the back. And that is the point. I'm going to apologize right straight up. I don't have a 10 picture in Western, but this is my husband's horse at White Fences in Florida, probably 4 years ago. And this got a 10. And I just didn't have the heart to just crop it all off, because I think you have to see me and the horse and the connection. But look, this is his working trot. This was in first level test, I think. I can't remember. He was either in training level or first level, because this horse was very green in the show ring. But this horse went around the 20-meter circle in this connection. So you have very small lateral pole flexion. You can see that. You can see he's in connection with the outside rein. The inside rein is quite soft, but this is clear connection on this rein. He's definitely reaching down and forward. You have plenty of impulsion and engagement. I perhaps could sit up more, but I will tell you, this is me. This is how, and I was in posting trot, I happened to be up, but I was busy focusing, hands together in line, and I'm over his point of motion. It got a 10. This is what we're looking for. Why? Because as he stretched down, good power, good engagement, has bend, went around the 20-meter circle accurately, and took up the reins well, which is also part of it. You have to be able to put him down, bring him back up, and the trot not change a lot. Your balance good. And they have to take the reins back to get a 10, which he did. But he kept his thoracic up. You can see it because of the activity. I was hoping this would help your eye, and I apologize it's not Western. Okay, we're looking at horse's balance, and so now I'm helping draw lines. I'm drawing lines to help train your eyes. So thank you. Again, Kim Depp sent us this photograph for one of the calls earlier this year and just gave me blanket permission to use it. Thank you. This was when her horse was transitioning into the basic, and this horse is moving along well. It has a great rear end. It's got good reach. She's right at the edge here of us wishing she was a little pole higher, but you know, this is okay, but we're hoping that throughout the test that this pole comes up a little bit more. Here's Dana again. This horse does, at this point in its training, was not as soft in the pole and the jaw, not as accepting in the mouth TMJ as this horse, but it tends to be a little bit more level. And some of this has to do with each horse's own personal conformation. But despite the conformation, we have to be very careful that we're trying to keep the brow, the pole, the crown piece, even at least even with the withers. And as they progress up the levels higher. So level is possible in intro and basic, but not below is tricky, not a good position. If it happens for a second, it happens to all horses for a second. While you're adjusting the reins, they take a misstep, they're going downhill. But in general, if they travel that way throughout, that is not the biomechanics that we need, because that will wear out their joints. We are not using the thoracic. We don't have enough weight behind. So it's not our goal. Thank you for the kindness of this rider for being willing to let me have downhill pictures on a very green horse. So at this moment, the horse was almost sort of level. He's just a little downhill. And as he goes along in the class, he gets a little tireder and he goes a little more downhill. And by the time we get a little further along, it's really downhill. But now we can begin to see that. And here we're talking about as he went downhill and his nose didn't go out, you see horses get behind the vertical too, as they kind of get onto their forehand. And you can see here that he's primarily, his weight is on his forehand, his hind leg isn't too active. But in this horse's defense, he was very, very green, and this rider was new to this. So no harm, no foul, and thank you for sending educational pictures. I desperately, desperately needed them. So very kind. Okay, where are we going and what is our goal? Well, our goal is engagement, which is compression of the hind legs. And here's a good one. We just looked at Kim Depp's horse, Lexi, when it was at basic, and now here it is with the line really going uphill when she was closer to the end of first level and going towards second level. And now you begin to see this uphill balance that we're looking for as she brought the mare along. This developed. And here's Joanne on her wonderful guy, looking fantastic, nicely uphill. Here's the lengthened jog with a line, and look how much, I think there's only 1 foot hardly on the ground there. She's so far off the ground in the lengthened jog. And here we are in shoulder in, which we're showing a perpendicular face with lateral pole flexion. And this is what shoulder in looks like, looking at it from C. And you can see that her shoulders are flexing tremendously, like we looked at that horse's skeleton. So engagement is the compression which will be used for sitting or ground cover, that the horses use the SI, the hip, the stifle, the hock, the fetlock, the pastern joint, and they compress those joints, and all of those flex, transfer weight from side to side. And that compression is engagement, and that can be used to compress and sit down, to spring forward or up. Now, continuous impulsion is necessary for this. If your horse is inconsistent in the energy level, then you have inconsistent compression. If you have engagement, if you have continuous impulsion, and you begin to work with the thoracic, you will begin to have uphill balance. And when uphill balance begins to occur, your horses begin to look like these horses, in that you're not looking at mouths open, you're looking at soft ears, the eyes look pretty good. You don't see a lot of tight muscles on horses that are looking okay at the moment. If they have engagement, impulsion, uphill throughness, then we get to self-carriage. And here's a little blue line to collection, which keeps reminding us the training wheel is behind my head. It's there because we have to keep referring to it. If you keep the rhythm, if you have the horse relaxed and it has some suppleness, if you have connection with the horse, they accept your aids, you have continuous impulsion, you can straighten or bend, then the result of the first 5 spokes being successful collection is a byproduct of the first 5 spokes. It develops through having all of these activities going on. Engagement is hind leg compression, thrust. It makes ground cover. It causes uphill balance. It produces cadence, and we have to learn all these words. Cadence is the spring of the horse off the ground. It is the suspension of the gait. Also, it causes adduction and reach. And adduction, we have to keep talking about, and we're going to look at the hind legs of this horse. But what it is when a horse engages, two things happen. The hind legs compress through the SI, the hip, the stifle, the jaw, and all the lower leg joints. But additionally, as the horse lands, the base of support gets closer together with the hind legs, and frequently, especially in turns, the inside leg steps closer to the outside hind leg. It steps under the midpoint of the horse. What this does is make a smaller balance point for the horse to balance on. For example, if you think about if a horse widens their legs behind, they have less support. So when you are looking at a horse from behind do lengthening jog and you see the hocks go wider and wider apart, what you know is that horse lacks engagement and it is not compressing the hind legs against the ground. It actually let its legs get straighter and it went wide behind to avoid taking weight behind, to avoid taking weight on the joints. It is not engaging. When a horse does engage and makes hind leg compression, then adduction, which is the hind leg coming closer to the center point of the horse, which makes a narrower base and a more stable base for the horse because it's a quadruped to balance on. And this is part of what happens. Reach, when we talk about reach, is how far the legs actually reach forward in the strides. And so when we talk about reach, it can be front reach or hind leg reach. So engagement, compression of the hind legs joints, which is the SI, stifle, hocks, fetlocks, and so on. It produces spring or power. And that spring or power can be used for thrust forward to cover ground or up, which makes arcing steps, arch steps, which is cadence, suspension off the ground. When engagement occurs, the horse steps well under the body, i.e. forward of the stifle, and it loads the joints of the hind legs, meaning it compresses them and it takes weight on the hind legs. Those joints close. If you look at a horse that's traveling along, no matter how much ground it appears to cover, if you have the feeling that the legs swing, but they don't close, the joints don't close, it's not engaging. It is swinging its legs from the hips, but it's not taking weight behind. And you do sometimes see this. This actually does happen. Additionally, the hind legs will come slightly closer together, which is to adduct, to form a more stable base of support for weight carrying, thrust, and propulsion. An evasion of this is going wide behind, and it is an evasion of engagement. And if you should get a paper from a judge that says wide behind, that is a true legitimate comment, and that is what they're getting at, that this is a problem with engagement and with the horse being willing to take weight through the, and it usually judges will say, well, it wouldn't take weight on the hocks, but that's true, but the stifle and the SI are very important in especially the lope. The SI has to function really, really well. And for horses where we see that the lope is no longer 3 beat, or it looks very lateral, or you see a really shuffly lope, many times it's the SI failing. The SI actually has to rock and flex a lot in the lope. So it's not only the hocks, it's not just that horses are hocky, it is all of these joints working together. And if there's anything wrong with any of those joints, you will see a problem in engagement and impulsion generally. So once again, here we go with different lines, but we're seeing this horse really step under. So we're seeing reach in the hind leg. We have tremendous separation of the hind leg. And this was the first, or where we can see she just stepped off the diagonal and lengthen lope. So these were the first two steps of lengthen lope. And this horse is super uphill. The thrust must be incredible because it looks like she's just moving. And you can see from the lines that there's thrust, compression, and reach going on. And that's what we're beginning to watch and train our eyes for the balance of the horses. What is their balance? So once again, we're back to looking at the training wheel and reminding ourselves that the first spoke to the right of midnight is rhythm. Do no harm. Do not break the gaits of the horses. They must be absolutely true. Suppleness, which is its own God-given flexibility and elasticity. Some of that is genetic, some of it is trainable. But the most important part of this suppleness of the second spoke is emotional and physical relaxation, enough that the horse trusts you and is trainable. Lack of emotional tension, that the horse trusts you. Connection, which is a euphemism. We talk a lot about, we use the word connection because we don't all use bits. But we are talking about the connection that we have to the horse as far as it being willing to soften at the pole, to give to the hand. Is it willing to accept our leg aids and all of our aids? Will it come round? Will it give in the pull, whether we're using a bosal, whether we're using a bitless bridle, whether we're using a bit? Connection also at some point when we talk about level 2 through 5, it says reliably on the bit in a soft connection. This is the whole thing, the on the bit situation, known as connection. Impulsion is continuous energy forward, and you cannot get a steady connection without having steady impulsion. Impulsion and connection are almost hard to separate, and they're very intertwined. Lack of energy causes unsteady tempos and losses of balance. And following that, the fifth spoke is straightness, improved alignment with balance. But also what we're getting at is once you can get a horse straight, you can also bend. And now you have the skills, you have the connection, and you have the impulsion, relaxation to really focus on bending. And as you can do that comes the lateral work and the more advanced movements, which put the horse more in balance, in a more uphill balance. And all of these 5 spokes bring you around to collection. And when that occurs, lightness of the forehand, you will be showing engagement. And the rider is the trainer or the person executing all of this to get the work done, working as a partner with the horse. And our idea is to accomplish this with harmony with our partner. So rider alignment that we were talking about last month becomes essential to the biomechanics because we're talking about the horse's center of motion and center of gravity. Also, we're beginning to realize that I had too many horses on here, and so there is a straight line from this rider's elbow to this horse's mouth, but in good equitation, that is part of a centered correct riding program. And this is part of our WD policy of elastic arms and a straight line to the elbow and riders in alignment. Now, our beginning rider here was beginning to really try to sit up straight, and she was thinking about it. She almost had her legs back far enough. However, this saddle is clearly one of those stock saddles that puts her in the back seat and gives her a little chair seat. So in her defense, we can see that this saddle does not help her equitation because we see that her seat ends up behind her leg. And of course, her back girth is just about where she would need to actually have her leg. So sometimes our back girth systems actually get in the way of our leg contact for some of our lateral work that we need to be doing. Um, he was a little balanced downhill, this young green fella, and our rider, I think, panicked. And what I think her mindset at this moment was, maybe I can pull him up. But we see this is interesting, and I only drew those on there not to be critical, but to begin to understand elasticity and correct alignment, that we have a broken line here to her elbow, which happened by the forearm being a little high. So hands to be down in front of the horns and the swell, and a straight line more to the bridle if we can get it. And it was a little bit more clear here about rider balance and horses balance together, because we become integrated. Our balance and their balance becomes integrated. So that went right along, ladies. You're back to this. Any questions or comments? I know, Teresa, you're there. She's a new judge. Is Joanne out there? Does anybody have any questions? Good to go. Oh, it's clear. In that case, I will prep you for next month. And our next month, we're going to continue just a little bit more with a discussion before we go on to our last call, which will be more about the lateral work. But working with us and with our students and judges about collection versus headset and engagement versus hawk action, which is a little bit more biomechanics. It was too long to put into this one tonight, but we're going to talk about conformation affects how horses move and how judges are trained to evaluate your horse, not against another horse. Like, it's not about their preference of what conformation that they're looking for or what breed of horse they're looking for. Our judges are trained that if your horse comes in and performs well and correctly for its conformation, it is rewardable. And we're going to talk to you about that, because that's very important for riders and trainers to understand, so that we can get the best performance from the horse that we have. So collection versus headset, engagement versus hawk action, so that we have a clearer understanding of collection the last spoke. Any comments? Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks. Bye. Oh, there's Suzanne. Well, we stopped